Right next to one of the largest quarries in Nova Scotia, and next to what used to be a dynamite facility, you'll find the Lake William Wetland Trail. It's a beautiful hike, relatively easy on a maintained path that is bordered on one side by industrial activity and on the other side by a pristine lakeshore that is often teeming with activity. It's a beautiful spot, it's a beautiful day, and it's where I'm on my walkabout today. Originally, I'd planned to hike across the street on what is known as the Powder Mill Lake Trail, which runs between Powder Mill and Rocky Lakes. But while a popular destination, it's private property, and officially hiking is not permitted there, which is on land which was once owned by a CIL company, or Canadian Industries Limited. One of the reasons hiking is discouraged there is because of the potential for explosives around the site. Explosives? Yep. You probably know CIL for CIL paints or CIL lawn fertilizer products. Those are mostly separate companies now, but that company actually started, or at least it has its history dating back to 1862 with the Hamilton Powder Company. They made black powder. The company over the years expanded and gone into all kinds of things, from nickel and salt mining, ammunition, and of course paints and lawn fertilizers. There were just so many different things, most of them related to chemicals somehow. But CIL is sort of in the middle of our story. Where our story starts is with the Acadia Powder Mills Company. The Acadia Powder Mills Company began operations in 1862 to supply explosives to local gold mining operations, something which will become important to my story a little later on. Now that is the reason that Powder Mill Lake has its current name, which was once Fish Lake. The power for the mills came by using hydropower from this body of water. When it opened, it was one of only 2 mills in Canada making black powder, the other being that Hamilton mill. They were also making gunpowder for hunting, grained powder for coal mining, linseed oils, and all manners of different types of paint. In 1869, the company changed its name to the Acadia Powder Company, and by 1880, they were making dynamite as one of the first in Canada to license Alfred Nobel's patent. The invention of dynamite by Alfred Nobel was an attempt by him to make workplaces safer. You have probably heard stories of the deaths which occurred during railway construction due to people using black powder. In any case, the invention of dynamite actually made Nobel one of the wealthiest individuals in the world. And he was troubled by the fact that his new invention was actually being used for military purposes. And as a result, when he died, he left an endowment to create the various Nobel Prizes, including the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1883, the Nobel Company actually purchased Acadia Powder Company. In 1890, there were 55 buildings on the site just north of this trail. The Hamilton Powder Company, the one which would later become an early part of CIL, then took over the site. But by 1899, Nobel was back in the game as he acquired a controlling interest in the Hamilton Powder Company, and with that, Acadia. It wasn't long after Nobel's companies were back in the ownership circle that around Christmas Day 1904, tragedy here was only narrowly averted. An explosion ripped through the site. Now, it's said that the shockwave blew out windows for 20 miles around and that in the town of Waverley, every single window was broken. If I'd been standing right here, I probably would have been knocked over. 20 men were on the site at the time, and they had just left the building. They got flattened in the explosion. Surprisingly, there were no deaths, although certainly there were injuries. And the cause of that explosion? A ton of black powder sitting in a dry house that overheated. There were deaths at the site. In 1883, Parts of the mill had exploded, resulting in the death of 3 men. But for all the years it operated, it had a relatively good safety record. It was in 1910 a majority of the explosives companies in Canada merged to become Canadian Explosives Limited and eventually Canadian Industries Limited, or CIL. Manufacturing of explosives moved to central Canada in 1913, but a small section of the site across the road from this trail has continued as a storage and sales operation for explosives under CIL and Atlantic Explosives Limited. That's where the trail is that I had originally intended to hike. You can see that trail entrance and the entrance to the explosive site a little further south on Rocky Lake Drive. These days there is a small park right across the street from where the Acadia Powder Company buildings once stood. The folks at the local museum tell me that when cars came into vogue and the Sunday drive was a thing, people would often take a loop through Bedford and they would stop there, perhaps for a picnic at lunch or sometimes to watch a sunset before heading on. In those days, many of the buildings may have still been visible. That small park may appear public, but is actually on private land owned by L. Archibald Holdings, as is much of the former land of the Acadia Powder Company. Some years ago, an agreement was reached with the Waverley Ratepayers Association, which allowed the association to manage and maintain a small park on the lake. The municipality also maintains a boat launch at the site, also in cooperation with the landowner. The land this trails on is in fact largely an easement across the land of Archibald Holdings, as well as some other landowners, such as CN Rail. I've reached the rail line to Halifax. Now, at one time, this rail line was a serious impediment to continuing on along this trail. In fact, behind me, there is another trail that goes to a level crossing across the rail line, one which was very illegal and very dangerous. Well, after the break, I'm going to be continuing from this bridge on to the rest of the trail. I'm on the Lake William Wetland Trail and I've reached the suspension bridge that crosses the main rail line. This is an active rail line with CN trains headed through regularly. The bridge cost almost $1 million and is constructed from panels recycled from the McDonald Bridge in Halifax, the old bridge, if you will. This is part of what is known as the CN Dartmouth subdivision. This line runs from Windsor Junction, where trains can go to Halifax or outbound in Nova Scotia and across Canada. At one time, there was talk of creating a rail yard not far from this very spot in Windsor Junction, where containers would arrive by truck and be put on rail to go to container terminals, thus alleviating truck traffic in downtown Halifax. That plan didn't last very long. This line heads into Dartmouth, serving Burnside, the Gypsum Piers and Wrights Cove, and then heads out past Alderney Landing, where there is a shunting yard, and onto the Autoport, where cars arrive by sea to be sent by rail across North America. Other plans have included using this line and the line to Halifax for commuter rail, including service to nearby Cobequid Road or Elmsdale. The plan included stations such as Burnside, Eastern Passage, downtown Dartmouth, Bedford Common, Wellington, and Elmsdale. This was shelved as the single track and location of potential stations were not as advantageous as harbour ferry options. This is Lake William, which is the namesake for this trail. Now, the Mi'kmaq called this lake Etobinog, which literally means open at both ends. This was also part of the Shubenacadie Waterway, and there was a marine railway at one end, and at this end, going into Lake Thomas, there was a lock. Now, the 1921 census showed 2 Mi'kmaq families living along the lake, and one of those was James Glode. And James Glode is distinguished as being the very first Mi'kmaq to, quote, take up arms in name of his country and king. He fought with the 219th Highland Brigade in World War I. The production of explosives was not the only business venture underway in this area. Right next to the Acadia site, the Dominion Electric Works was constructed to manufacture fuses for blasting. Two men from DuPont in New Jersey came here to teach people how to make those fuses. The employees were mostly women from all parts of Nova Scotia, and one of them wrote, quote, "The work was first covering the wires with cotton, then they were dipped in a mixture of tar, then the caps were sulfured to the end of each fuse, then they were dried and folded. The pay for this work? Well, it was $1 a day." With companies nearby supplying just about everything you would need to operate a mine, it will come as no surprise that there were mining operations in this area. In fact, mining operations continue to this day. On the trail I've been walking, I headed in towards the lake and I'm now walking parallel to the lake. And in all that time, I've been roughly 1.5 kilometers from the Rocky Lake Quarry. Now that quarry is a very important quarry in the province. It is roughly 45 acres in size, but has been approved to expand to 445 acres. They make gravels there out of the high quality rock in the ground, but it wasn't gravel, it was shinier stuff that started the mining boom in Waverley. Gold was discovered in Waverley in 1861 on the farm of Charles P. Allen. Today, there is a high school named for him. He established a bucket and furniture factory not far from the intersections of Lake Thomas and Lake William. He renamed the farm Waverley after the novel Waverley by Sir Walter Scott. Well, Allen had 10 children, and his original land purchase covered 700 acres. The 50 pounds he spent to purchase a home in 1847, well, that house still stands. Today, it's a bed and breakfast called an old manor house bed and breakfast, located at the intersection of Lake Thomas and Lake William. It was quiet in those days. There was the Allen family who were making furniture and chairs, putting them on horse-drawn carts and sending them to Halifax for sale. And there was the Scary family. They were farming. Things changed on August 23rd, 1861, when Henry Taylor announced in the Halifax Press that gold had been found on Allen's farm. Once gold was found on the farm, people flocked to the area, and the population quickly grew to 2,000, many working in the 30 gold mines of the area. Joseph Howe himself arrived and returned to Halifax, nuggets of gold in hand. Flooding ultimately caused many to give up, and for a lull in mining to occur. But in 1899, the Waverley Gold Mining Company took a more widespread approach and continued on for another 4 years. The last of the gold mines in Waverley closed in 1940, and over their life, 73,000 ounces was mined here, most of it actually before 1903. Few would actually recognize the industrial mining history that existed in Waverley all that time. These days, it's an area mostly known for recreational opportunities year-round. This is the pink lady slipper, and you see them around at this time of year. You see them and you think, oh, I'd love to pick those or maybe transplant them and put them in my garden at home, but that's a really bad idea, and in fact, they won't survive. And that's because the pink lady slipper actually has a symbiotic relationship with a very specific fungus that grows in the ground around the base of the roots. And the lady slipper itself feeds off that fungus, and the fungus feeds off the lady slipper. And it develops over time, and as the lady slipper gets older over the years and grows, that develops into a very important food source. So if you take this and plant it at home, it simply won't survive. So leave it here. You should leave it here anyways, but it isn't going to grow anyways if you transplant it at home. Well, I'm nearing the end of the Lake William wetland trail. You can actually see the trail's a bit rougher here, and this is where it's still under construction. It ends a few hundred meters further along, and there is a space between this and the Portobello Plain where you can pick up the Lake Charles Trail. There's a water crossing and some other things that have to be dealt with before that trail will be finished. But as it stands, this is an absolutely beautiful place to come for a hike. After the break, I'm going to be headed to yet another place where trails are being constructed for everyone's enjoyment. That's the Sackville Lakes.
Won't you be mine? Feel the sunshine.
At over 700 acres, Sackville Lakes Provincial Park is a suburban gem. The trails here are managed by the Sackville Lakes Parks and Trails Association and include part of the Trans-Canada Trail. Most of the trails are on the edge of Second Lake itself, and that's where I'm headed on today's Walkabout. If you're looking for a place to get out with a variety of relatively short trails that are easy to navigate, including some parts with scooters, strollers, and certain wheelchairs, this park is a great choice, especially if you live in or near Sackville. The park includes 70% of the shoreline of Second Lake and 15% of the shoreline of First Lake. Around Second Lake, there are trails which range from less than a kilometer to almost 3. Additional trails can be found on the other side of First Lake Drive, surrounding First Lake. Some of these are part of Second Lake Provincial Park, while others are trails managed by community groups on municipal land. One of the really interesting things about Sackville development history is how First Lake over time became overused and overstressed, and Second Lake became almost the forgotten lake. There was very little development in this part of Sackville before the 1960s and 70s. It was mainly woodlots and farms. Then, in the 1960s and 70s, the provincial government decided to create a land assembly for an affordable housing area that would be on the outskirts of the cities of Halifax and Dartmouth. They called it the Sackville Lakes District, and that land assembly included the land that is now this park. To give you an idea of just how underdeveloped this area was, First Lake was actually a source of water for the Baxter Nursery on the Windsor Highway, what is now Sackville Drive. They would pipe that water down through to Sackville Drive because there was really not much development at all in between here and there. Looking at development around First Lake today, it's hard to imagine that. Second Lake simply remained a little more isolated, even going back quite a long time. During the War of 1812, African-American escaped slaves came to Nova Scotia. Now, many settled in Hammond's Plains and Preston. However, smaller groups settled along what is now the Cobequid Road to the east of here. Lord Dalhousie, who was lieutenant governor in 1817, visited some of these people and noted that they had cleared and seeded the land. But even those lots didn't quite reach Second Lake, nor did the stagecoach route to Truro, which went by this area. The north side of the lake did see some minor development pressure with the coming of the Dominion Atlantic Railway and the Beaverbank-Windsor Junction crossroad. There was a homestead that shows up on maps from the 1860s on that side of the lake, and in fact, the foundations are still visible there in the woods. But the pressures were just not the same. Development here just didn't happen in the same way because if you look at the geography, there's actually a very large hill between First Lake and Second Lake. As late as the mid-1900s, people who grew up in the Windsor Junction area recall Mi'kmaq families camping near Windsor Junction Station and coming up towards the lake to collect ash saplings to make baskets, axe handles, and other items. So it appears that historically this was an important location for Indigenous people to come to. It's very likely they also fished in this lake, which supports many fish species, including white sucker, smallmouth bass, brook trout, and brown bullhead. But those impacts on the lake would again have been marginal. The Mi'kmaq knew this lake as Makapukajak, which translates to large, round, little lake. It would have been impossible for the Mi'kmaq to see the lake from the air, but two drumlins create peninsulas which make the lake anything but round. In fact, it's really more like three basins. The wildlife on the other side of the lake is being quite noisy today, and that's amazing to be able to hear that in a suburban area over the traffic. European settlers had a number of names for this lake. They called it Middle Lake, they called it Double Lake. Across to the other side in Windsor Junction, they called this Keogh's Lake because there was a family that, by the name of Keogh, who had a farm that pretty much went up to the edge of what we now know as Second Lake. But regardless of what you call it, there was never a lot of development right around the edges of the shoreline. And as a result, this lake never faced the same pressures that First Lake faced. Later on, another situation ended up limiting development around this lake. In the years leading up to the new Pockwalk water reservoir, Second Lake was a source of drinking water for Sackville and Bedford and was thus protected. It was said to have had a capacity to serve 20,000 people, though it never ended up reaching that peak as Pockwalk came online in the late 70s. Second Lake is about 2.5 kilometers long and 300 acres in size. It's a headwater lake for the Shubenacadie River system, and from here flows out to Third Lake through a number of smaller lakes and ponds and rivers before reaching Powdermill Lake and Lake William, where I was hiking earlier. It's still relatively untouched, at least comparatively to First Lake. It was during that time of provincial land consolidation in the 1960s and 70s that people first pushed for a large park in the area. But it took until 1998 before a number of regional community groups merged to form the Second Lake Regional Park Association. Then, in 1999, they successfully saw the transfer of the 700 acres, which makes up this park, from the Department of Housing and Municipal Affairs, where it had remained as housing reserve, to the Department of Natural Resources, where it sat for another 15 years before officially being protected. Author Marty Rubin once said that parks and playgrounds are the soul of a city. Now, whether it's a trail across lands once better defined by mining and explosives, or a provincial park along a spectacular lake, it's important to have places that we can get outside that are also close to home. Sometimes you don't have to go very far to find nature when you're in search of your next walkabout.
Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, feel the sunshine. Oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, feel the sunshine.